Before the desert ever burned his name into the boards of a saloon, John Henry Holliday knew a different heat. A Georgia summer clinging to clapboard houses, cicadas trying their hand at choir, and a household where courtesy was as natural as breath. His father, a veteran and a man of standing, measured words the way a surveyor measures land. His mother taught a gentler arithmetic, hymns, handshakes, the quiet dignity of Sunday best. He would carry those manners west like a pressed flower in a pocket Bible, a reminder of fragrance in a world of gun oil and dust. He also carried a cough. Plainshumanities.unl.edu. Philadelphia polished him. At the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery, he learned the patient geometry of the human mouth, angles of enamel, tiny territories of pain. He graduated young, a craftsman with a surgeon's hands and a future set neatly like a row of gold foil in a cabinet. It might have gone on that way. A tidy office, a polite shingle, a life measured out in appointments and afternoon light. But tuberculosis has its own appointments. The cough strengthened. The mirror showed a hollowing. Doctors advised the ancient remedy of the 19th century: dry air, sunshine, rest. The prescription was not merely hope, it was the consensus of the time, the closest thing to a plan before microbes had names. Dallas promised air and work. He crossed the South and set his instruments out beside Dr. John A. Segar, the two of them proud, deft, and briefly triumphant. At the Dallas County Fair, the pair swept the board. Best set of teeth in gold, best in vulcanized rubber, and best set of artificial teeth and dental wear. Imagine the smile of a patient holding a mirror, the small gasp at a mouth remade. Imagine the young dentist's own breath catching for a different reason, a fit triggered by laughter. Skill could carve perfection in ivory, but it could not sculpt time. The cough did not love the waiting room. Patients flinched, so he went where conversation was quicker and favors were counted by the hour. Saloons. A pharaoh layout is its own anatomy. Bucking cards, a bank to be guarded, a dealer's eyes sweeping like a metronome. There, Holliday found a theater suited to his condition. Gambling was performance, controlled voice, steady hands, an ability to convince men twice your size that you could make trouble vanish, if only they cut the deck. In Fort Griffin and other cattle towns, folks began calling him Doc, a name that honored the tools he still carried and the profession he was already leaving. Somewhere between a syringe and a sawed-off, a gambler's mask fused to a gentleman's face. Mary Catherine Horney walked into his story through a door full of noise. Men called her Big Nose Kate, less an insult than a brand carried by a woman who insisted on naming herself. Educated, stubborn, and frank, she had carved her own room out of Western Nights, taking the independence the era offered in its roughest form. With Kate, Doc found something sharp enough to pair loneliness, someone who could laugh in 4 languages, and who wasn't frightened by a cough, a card table, or a reputation. They orbited from rooming house to hotel, and she kept close when breath came short. Legends grow hungry where records are thin, but the facts are sturdy enough. She was the one companion tied to Doc by more than gossip. The dealer from Georgia did not abandon dentistry all at once. In Dodge City, he published a neat notice: J.H. Holliday, dentist, where satisfaction is not given money will be refunded. It sounds almost tender now, a pledge from a craftsman trying to keep faith with the work of his youth. But in the same town at the same hour, the saloon doors swung more often than the office door, and the cards paid steadier than molars. And in Dodge, at last, the friendship arrived that would fix his name to a single, unforgettable street. Wyatt Berry, Stapp Earp, was a man whose job description changed by the season: farmer, constable, buffalo hunter, peace officer, but whose personal arithmetic stayed plain: keep order, walk steady. Historians argue about the exact night and the exact shape of the trouble, but an accepted refrain remains that Holliday, in some ugly tangle of cowboys and gun hands, stood up in a saloon and made a calculation. This is my friend. Whether it was a muzzle pressed to a brow or a single word uttered in a dead calm, Wyatt remembered the rescue. Gratitude is a frontier currency more durable than silver. They would spend it, with interest, in Arizona. Between games and coughing fits, the West taught Doc its other curriculum: how a town's fate depends on who holds the freight contracts, who sits the bench, And which paper, the merchants or the ranchers, sets the story by morning. He learned that a tin star does not end all arguments. It simply changes the rules. He learned that a man's posture at a card table often tells you how he'll stand in the street. And he learned, night after night, that breath is the loudest clock. When he could, he still opened his kit, tugged a chair close, and bent over some cowhand's aching mouth with a delicacy few expected from the deadly dentist. When he couldn't, he kept the room safe with a dealer's eyes and a hand that moved just enough to imply a derringer. Prescott wrote him down as dentist in the 1880 census, which feels like another small mercy. Paper refusing to surrender the man entirely to legend. But the rumor growing across the territory was not of fillings and plates. It was of tombstone, a word shaped like a dare. Silver sang in the hills there. Merchants spoke in ledgers. Cowboys, some honest and some not, wrote in dust columns along the border like weather systems you learned to watch. Ordinances ordered citizens to holster pride and check iron. Money argued for civilization, while whiskey argued for everything else. To a sick gambler loyal to a lawman, tombstone sounded like both a chance and a sentence. He and Kate followed the rails in the talk. Entering that young city felt like stepping into a room where the music hadn't decided whether to be waltz or knife fight. The main street carried hope stacked 2 stories high. Boardwalks, tailors, stationers, restaurants busy as hives. But the alleys whispered of remuda and rustle, of badges that meant order to some and tyranny to others. Dollar for dollar, a boomtown is a bet that order can be enforced for long enough to let capital grow. Tombstone placed that bet every dawn. Men like Virgil Earp, city marshal and U.S. deputy, took responsibility for collecting it. Men like Doc, drifting but loyal, often found themselves, officially or not, standing close when the collection turned ugly. Doc looked around and recognized a town built precisely for his contradictions. A dentist who could deal, a southerner who could shave insult to a single syllable, sir, and make it cut like glass. A sick man who could hold still while healthy men trembled. He took Faro Banks that autumn and walked Allen Street with a cough that turned heads and a gaze that turned some hands away from their holsters. He had not come west to be deadly. He had come west to breathe. But in the border country of 1880, breath and danger occupied the same room. Within a year, one late October afternoon would hammer them together forever, binding a gentleman from Georgia to 30 seconds of gun smoke and a judgment that is still read aloud. For now he dealt, he drank, he tried to sleep through the rattle in his chest. In the mirror of a boarding house washstand, he saw, perhaps, a man trying to keep 2 oaths, one to the life he trained for, and one to the friend he had chosen. The desert was already measuring him for legend. Tombstone did not look like a myth when you walked it. It smelled of mule sweat and hot pine, of bread loaves and blasting powder. Men shouted prices over burlap sacks while water wagons rattled past. The tailors pressed new suits for miners who struck luck and wanted to spend like it would never run out. The very ground sounded busy, ore cars clanking from the Good Enough and the Tough Nut, wagons grinding toward the stamp mills along the San Pedro. You could buy oysters packed in ice, a new felt hat, or a Bible printed in Boston, then step outside and hear the morning roll call of roosters and revolvers. In that bustle, a sick gambler could blend into the noon light and go unnoticed, unless he coughed. Doc's cough knocked gently at the door of every hour, a private metronome under the town's public racket, reminding him that each hand dealt was also borrowed time. A boomtown is an argument pretending to be a city. Tombstone's loudest voices spoke of commerce and permanence, church steeples, schoolhouses, capital accounts, ordinances read aloud. Another set of voices rode in from the ranches and border washes, where cattle moved like weather and law looked the other way if you knew whom to pay. The newspapers made it simple. The epitaph loved the Earps and businessmen. The Nugget often found sympathy for ranch interests and for Sheriff Johnny Bean, a man with easy manners and a working politician's instinct for leaning with the wind. But simple is not the same as true. Both factions contained decent men and hard cases. Both wanted order. Only one preferred a tin star's definition, the other a saddle's. The city council wrote Ordinance Number 9 in a hand that business could appreciate. No carrying of deadly weapons inside town without a permit. It wasn't about genteel ideas. It was about insurance rates and keeping the sidewalks clear of panic. In theory, a man checked his iron when he hit Allen Street, left it at a hotel, livery, or the marshal's office, then took a claim ticket like a promise that he could be dangerous again when he rode out. In practice, pried objects to claim tickets. Men who had survived Apaches and ambushes did not like surrendering the weight on their hips to please any counsel. Plenty complied. Plenty didn't. What does a law mean when every second storefront serves whiskey and every third man believes himself reasonable until the fifth glass? Into this uneasy order walked the Cochise County Cowboys, not as a single gang, but as a weather pattern. Names as common as fence posts to Tombstone, Ike and Billy Clanton, Tom and Frank McClory, Curly Bill Brocious, Johnny Ringo, and a fog of hands who drifted in and out like smoke. Some of them ranched honestly and trailed cattle into town, with dust on their hats and money in their pockets. Some rode the border's gray economy, lifting stock south of the line and washing it north. Mexico sent rurals to object. The U.S. Army frowned from its posts. The desert shrugged and concealed tracks as it always had. If you were a merchant with a ledger balanced to the penny, you wanted sheriffs and marshals to make that shrug disappear. If you were a cowboy who counted your cattle in the dark by feel, you wanted town law to stop acting like a noose. Doc dealt faro at the Oriental, a bright room that pretended to be civilized with velvet and lamps. The management, Milt Joyce, chief among them, liked their reputation tidy. The profits depended on it. Doc brought money to the tables and trouble to the doorway. He kept his tone polite and his eyes cold, the way a Southerner can plant a flag of anger in the word sir. One night the temperature rose too fast. There were words. Joyce disarmed him and clubbed him for good measure. Doc left, stung and bleeding, returned with another pistol and drove lead through wood and whiskey. The bartender caught a ball, and the Oriental caught a new rumor or two. A magistrate later measured the chaos into fines. The town learned a lesson it never forgot. Doc could be as neat as a surgeon and as reckless as a storm, and you never knew which you would meet until your name was already being written down. The cough did not excuse him. It only outlasted the headlines. Meanwhile, the countryside kept its own score. On a March night in 1881, a stage rattling toward Benson bucked under gunfire. Driver Bud Philpott and a passenger died where the road turned black. Names began to rise in the saloon air. Leonard, Head, Crane, desperados with a record for grabbing other people's property at gunpoint. Cowboys heard a different version, floated by men who wanted the Earps discredited. Wasn't it convenient how Wyatt and his circle always stood strong in the newspaper while the cowboys took the blame? In bars and on porches, they accused Doc Holliday of whispering with stage robbers and setting up enemies for the fall. That's the thing about rumor. It makes a fine instrument for men who don't want to tune their facts. Doc denied it with a stare that suggested pleasure at the idea of settling such talk on a blank patch of street. Wyatt closed ranks with him. The cowboys did the same with one another, and the town's afternoons grew crowded with the kind of watching you do when you're measuring the distance to a wall and wondering whether you'll be asked to stand against it. Politics stood shoulder to shoulder with fear. Sheriff Bain smiled and smoothed. He could drink with ranchers and shake hands with merchants, give interviews that sounded like wisdom, and end the night with both sides grumbling that he'd favored the other. The Earps, Virgil with the municipal duty, Wyatt with the federal reach, Morgan with the steady presence, took a more direct approach. They were not innocent men. They were convinced men. Their creed was a ledger's creed. If law wasn't enforced at the door, capital would leave by the back alley. To Bean, that sounded like overreach. To the cowboys, it sounded like tyranny. To Doc, it sounded like a reason to stay near friends. Summer burned out and left a copper taste. Chance encounters bloomed into challenges and then withered into promises of future reckoning. If you walked Allen Street at twilight, you could hear it. Two men muttering through clenched teeth, another telling his companion he would see him in the morning, which every man present understood as a small declaration of intention. At the Alhambra and the Crystal Palace, dealers watched the doors more than the cards. At the Grand Hotel, upstairs, parties turned quiet when boots stopped below. A cough could start a fight. A grin could end one. And above it all, the hills kept spitting silver into wagons, reminding everyone that heaven's gates might be narrow, but Tombstone's vaults were wide. If only pistols could be persuaded to nap. A law on paper is one thing. A law in a man's hand is another. Ordinance number 9 began to be tested openly. Cowboys rode in bristling and dared the town to strip them. Now and then they checked their pistols as required. An exhausted peace. More often they said they would, later. Officers issued citations in hard words. Virgil Earp walked the line between provocation and surrender, with the posture of a man who knows the line will move no matter what he does. Doc shadowed the Earps in the gambling rooms, drifting through the same 10 doors a dozen times a day, part sentinel, part ghost. He was not deputized for every hour, not official for every motion, yet men saw him and behaved as if he were the rough edge of a badge. Sometimes that kept the peace. Sometimes it put fuel to the slow, bright fuse of 1881. And then came October, when the air in mining towns turns thin and sharp as a blade. The day before it all broke, the talk swelled and curdled. Ike Clanton drank himself into a platform, boasting that he would settle old accounts with the Earps and Doc. Settle them plain. There were threats, some overheard, some repeated, some invented. Virgil cracked him over the head and hauled him before a judge for carrying arms in violation of the ordinance. Ike paid his fine and kept his anger. Men who understood odds saw that the house now held a bad shoe. The next morning, armed cowboys gathered down by the little lot beside Fly's photography gallery. They said they meant to leave town. The Earps said they meant to disarm them first. Johnny Benn stepped between like a man separating two fires with a hat. Doc Holliday woke to the bright certainty that the argument that had pretended to be a city was done pretending. A dentist's hands, a gambler's gaze, and a dying man's resolve walked alongside 3 lawmen down Fremont Street. The fuse had burned to the powder. They came down Fremont like 4 notes struck on a single chord. Virgil in front, with the calm of a man who had written his name under too many town ordinances to back away now. Wyatt beside him, shoulders squared as if the street itself were something to be moved. Morgan a half step off, eyes narrowed, and Doc Holliday in a dark coat with the short, ugly mouth of a double-barrel shotgun tucked beneath the fabric like a secret. On the far side of the dust, the cowboys waited in a cramped lot beside Fly's photography gallery, where fences leaned and a hack horse shifted as if it, too, felt the day's edges sharpen. Ike Clanton was there, and Billy Clanton, and the McClory brothers, Tom and Frank, with Billy Claiborne hovering in a limbo of bravado and doubt. Sheriff Johnny Benn had wagged his hat, said they were disarmed, but tin stars and courthouses have always known how easily a word is bent in the heat. Picture the space, not the wide myth of a Hollywood alley, but a narrow slice of ground cluttered with legs of fence and a shed's shadow. The men facing each other at a distance so intimate you could smell the other's coffee. Virgil lifted his hand, the marshal's hand, and spoke the words that kept merchants in business and set graveyards to work. "Throw up your hands, I want your guns." It was the same sentence he had spent months repeating on Allen Street, an attempt to lend the ordinance the weight of his voice. It might have worked a dozen other mornings. Not this one. Who drew first? It is the question that makes historians frown and storytellers grin. The epitaph had a version before sundown, the nugget countered by breakfast. Men along the boardwalk swore they saw a muzzle lift, or a coat jerk, or a hand slap leather. Later, in a courtroom that smelled of ink and damp wood, witnesses would contradict each other with confidence. But in the lot, in that breath, everything happened at once. The street exhaled, and a shotgun boomed like a door slammed by the Almighty. The first sound was the deepest, and most put it in Doc Holliday's hands. The left barrel of the coach gun cracking the air and driving its heavy charge toward Tom McClory. Some said Tom had one hand on his horse's reins and one on a rifle scabbard. Some said he had none on any weapon at all. The pellets drove him back like a man who has been suddenly reminded of gravity. Frank McClory brought his 6-gun up and sighted into the crush of bodies. Billy Clanton did the same, young and fierce, and the gap between the sides exploded into smoke so thick even the sun took a step back. The distances were indecently close. Wyatt Earp fired with his revolver almost at arm's length. Morgan and Virgil staggered under the blowback of their own pistols. Ike Clanton, who had promised all week that he would plant the Earps, found himself unarmed, screaming that he was not fighting, fingers up and eyes white, then running, grabbed briefly by Wyatt and released towards safety and witness benches. Billy Claiborne retreated in a blur of self-preservation, the bravado pouring out of him like whiskey hitting the street. Another barrel went, Doc's second, and the lot lurched into a different arrangement. A horse took a ball and screamed. Hat crowns shredded. Frank staggered and kept his hand, kept firing, as if pride alone could hold a man upright. Billy Clanton, desperate and game, braced himself against a wall and worked his gun like a craftsman, even as blood glazed his shirt. Virgil felt heat along his leg and hip where lead had taken hold. Morgan folded briefly and straightened, like a man refusing to be told by pain what to do. Through it all, Wyatt stood in the open, unmarked, as if the storm that shredded hats could not pick out the one man the stories would need to remain untouched. It lasted half a minute. Some say 31 seconds, some say less. You could count it by heartbeats or by spent shells. You could measure it by the number of times a man makes the decision to live. Too close to miss, too close not to. When the gun smoke thinned, the inventory of the day lay where it had to. Tom McClory down and still, Frank McClory falling, Billy Clanton propped in defiance and swaying, Virgil and Morgan wounded, Doc grazed along the hip with a welt he would wear like a ribbon and joke about later, and Wyatt untouched, though the world would tell itself stories about why. The echo that followed was not the kind that dies. It spilled into the saloons and swelled in the press room, and by nightfall was marching through the country on telegraph feet. Bean bellowed, citizens argued, and the city judge prepared for a drumbeat of testimony that would not stop for 30 days. Justice of the Peace Wells Spicer presided. Not a man of dime novels, but a man who liked a record where it belonged. The hearing's language still breathes. Who was armed? Who advanced? Who raised the first weapon? What the ordinance required? Whether a marshal can enforce the law against men who are already choosing to ignore it. Doc sat there with the pallor of a man whose lungs were bad and whose manner was unrepentant. He had brought a scattergun to an argument about paperwork. He did not apologize for that arithmetic. Witnesses contradicted each other so thoroughly you might think they'd attended different gunfights in different towns. Some heard Virgil declare his purpose clearly. Others claimed the lawmen fired into men trying to comply. The cowboy's friends spoke of murder. The Earp's allies spoke of duty. Spicer listened long enough to grow older. When he finally wrote, he borrowed the careful cadence of law. The killings, he said, were justified. A necessary act committed in the course of official duty. Whatever else the town argued about. The court said the marshal had the right to defend himself and his officers when men refused to give up weapons and brought steel to bear at breath's distance. The paper that bore his conclusion tempered the heat by exactly the amount ink can. After the decision, partisans read their futures in the judge's lines the way miners tested ore with teeth. The cowboys were not convinced, they were cornered. The Earps won their day in court, they did not win the night in the alleys. A myth came to life the same week, that Doc Holliday killed more men that afternoon than the ledger can bear. In truth, when you peel back the songs and the celluloid, Tom McClory is the only death you can plant firmly at Doc's feet. And even there, the testimonies argue over inches and intentions. Myths require large numbers because fear does. The record prefers small ones because paper does. What can be said without embroidery is this. Doc was steady when others shook. He could aim in a storm. He could speak in a whisper that bent louder men into silence. He was not the fastest gun west of the Pecos, nor the deadliest in Arizona. He was a gentleman who had learned to make his cough a kind of metronome and his gaze a kind of weapon. On Fremont Street, in a lot measured in strides, he fired a shotgun that chopped the argument down to size. In the stories told later, he will become blade and thunder, raining death like a plague. In the ledger, he is a sick gambler with a doctor's hands who stood where loyalty put him and did the arithmetic of survival without flinching. When the bodies were carried, when the blood washed thin on the earth and slipped beneath the fence rails, Tombstone tried to go back to business. But business had changed shape. Men altered their routes to avoid the lot, as if the air there were heavier. Cups lifted more carefully, doors opened slower. Even the telegraph's chatter seemed to hesitate. The Earps kept their posts, but they walked with the knowledge that victory on paper is the beginning of a different kind of war. The cowboys muttered in shadows where stables breathed and saddles hung like sleeping beasts. Somewhere in that press of rumor and pride, revenge began to sketch itself. Doc coughed into a linen square in a boarding house room that evening, poured a swallow of whiskey that tasted like metal, and studied his hands. Steady as ever, stained now with a hint of powder. He had come west to chase air the doctors promised would help. Instead, he had found a town that required breath to be spent like coin. 30 Seconds on Fremont had purchased a verdict, a legend, and a debt no court could settle. The night was colder after sundown. In a few months, shotguns would boom again from a dark corner, and a billiard room would go quiet, and Wyatt Earp would decide that a judge's ink was not enough to answer a brother's blood. But that is another chapter. For now the street lay still, as if the desert had paused to hear whether men would keep their hands or raise them. The first shot came from darkness that had learned Tombstone's map as well as any deputy. December 28, 1881, Virgil Earp stepped into the rain-slicked night with the tired swagger of a man who had enforced the same ordinance until it felt like a prayer. A lantern swung, boots tapped wet boards, and then a shotgun spoke from a second-story window. Buckshot ripped coat and flesh and bone. The marshal jolted forward and clutched a left arm that would never again obey orders cleanly. Men ran from doorways in their stocking feet. A woman screamed, then clamped her own mouth with both hands as if to catch the sound. The morning headlines would call it assassination. The evening faces called it what it was, revenge. Virgil lived, though the arm hung like a broken promise. The Earps packed his dignity into a sling and pretended the town could carry on. In the saloons, cards whispered again, and Doc's cough resumed its metronome. Yet the air had changed weight. Talk dampened, laughter stopped 2 beats early, and you could trace the path of rumor the way you follow smoke to a stove. The cowboys were pleased with themselves. They had answered courtroom ink with iron. It would not be enough. Not for long. March 18, 1882 carried a draft of cold into Campbell and Hatch's billiard room. Morgan Earp, younger and usually easy with a grin, leaned to line up a shot. The cue's chalk dust rose like a small blue cloud. Someone outside, down an alley where rain puddled in hoof prints, settled a rifle across a windowsill or a stacked crate. It is the kind of decision that takes a man only a breath. Now. The bullet smashed glass, punched gaslight, and found Morgan's back. He collapsed into a tangle of felt and wood and blood as the room broke into running and ducking. Later, men argued over words, whether he murmured, "Don't let them carry me," or nothing at all, but there is little to argue about in the end. Morgan died, and every lamp in Tombstone felt harsher for it. Grief moves differently in a mining town. It does not slow the machinery, it changes its pitch. Wyatt's face closed like a door. Allie Earp's hands trembled as she arranged Virgil for travel. California and long quiet for a wounded man who still believed in duty, like other men believe in luck. Wyatt promised to see his brother delivered to the train at Tucson. He also promised something else, silently in the mirror that night, while the lamp hummed. No more waiting on judges. He went to work on the side of the law that answers to the federal eagle instead of a city seal. A temporary deputy U.S. Marshal's authority gave him reach where a town ordinance could not. He picked his men with the same economy he used to count seconds in a gunfight. Doc Holliday, pale and steady. Warren Earp, a younger brother who had run out of patience. Sherman McMaster, who knew the cowboys' ways from the inside. Turkey Creek Jack Johnson and Texas Jack Vermillion, riders with iron in their nerves. And sometimes Dan Tipton, willing to carry word or risk for the cause. Bean, wearing his sheriff's badge like a politician's boutonniere, protested the change in weather. Wyatt did not argue. He packed ammunition. The train hissed in Tucson on March 20th like an animal that did not care about human quarrels. Virgil and his wife took seats for California, pain and prayer tucked into their luggage. Wyatt stepped down to the cinders, eyes adjusting to the yard's lamps, feeling the desert around the edges where light becomes suggestion. In that theater, Frank Stillwell chose his role poorly. Accounts differ on how the steel found him, whether he ran, whether he reached, whether he begged, but the coroner's tally does not differ. Bullets, many. A body left on the ground with the indignity thieves reserve for the overconfident. The newspapers ate it with both hands. A Cochise County grand jury answered with indictments for murder, Doc's name prominent among them, as if punctuation. It didn't slow the horses. The posse turned north and east into whetstone shadows where Ocotillo and Mesquite draw thorned lines across a man's shins. They wanted Curly Bill Brocious, who had laughed in 100 saloons and kept order among disorderly men through force of personality and a practiced willingness to kill. March 24th, 1882, call it Iron Springs or Mescal Springs if you prefer the old maps, delivered the theater again. Wyatt rode ahead to water and found the cowboys. Some say a dozen, some say fewer, all armed, all ready to turn a spring into a grave. The first exchange blew dust into soup. Horses screamed. A man named Johnny Barnes, or Johnny Barnes's legend, went down hard, depending on which witness you keep in your pocket. Curly Bill, by Wyatt's telling, took a shotgun's full mouth and tumbled back into the brush, laughter replaced by nothing. Doc fired measured, low, as he always did, the smoke curling around his jaw like a scarf. When the roar drowned itself and the echoes decided to go home, the cowboys scattered and the posse kept moving. Whether you credit every detail or not, the math at the end equals this. The Vendetta ride did what it said on its tin. Back in Tombstone's courts and offices, men built paper nets. Bean produced warrants like a stage magician, flourishing doves. Wyatt and his riders had done murder, said one side. They had executed justice when the law refused to, said the other. There was no single place to stand and be safe from either argument. So they did not stand. They rode to ranch houses that smelled of coffee and danger, to passes where the wind sounded like a man whispering your name wrong. They crossed more than lines on a map. They crossed into a state where everything is choice and consequence, stripped of rhetoric. Doc coughed green into a handkerchief and then jotted a line in his head for later retelling. The way men who expect to die make their days matter by narrating them to themselves. The ride carved a trail toward Colorado, where the thin air gives every breath the sensation of effort. Tombstone's reach grew long fingers, telegrams, deputy sheriffs, lawyers with briefcases and ambitions. Denver wore a new city's pride like cologne, streetcars, good hats, and an appetite for scandal. When officers placed a hand on Doc's shoulder there in May 1882, he didn't resist. He looked for a moment like a dentist again, composed, measuring the room as if it were a mouth needing calm and care. The charge, extradition to Arizona on the Stillwell killing. The punishment if granted, an almost certain meeting with men who didn't intend to bother with fair fights. Enter Bat Masterson, the peculiar American institution. A friend with legal instincts and the stamina to sit in offices until governors remember they too have reputations. Governor Frederick Pitkin weighed papers thin as onion skin and thick with politics. Arizona wanted Holliday's body. Colorado considered whether Arizona would keep it alive long enough to make the trial worth the name. Technical flaws in the requisition and the scent of frontier vengeance clinging to every sentence tilted the scales. Pitkin declined to send Doc back to the desert that had already shortened him. The deadly dentist walked out into a mile-high sunlight he had not expected to see again. What did the victory feel like? Ask a man who has been drowning how the first dry breath tastes. Then ask him how far the shore is. The Vendetta ride had done its arithmetic. A dead man in Tucson, a dead legend at a spring, a string of fugitives and friends scattered, and a mining town that tried to pretend the silver alone could guarantee peace. Wyatt headed farther on, the badge growing lighter and heavier by turns. A man who had decided that justice and law are cousins who sometimes refuse to speak to one another. Doc rested in Denver, thin as a question mark, and stared at the ceiling as the cough rearranged his ribs. He was free for the moment, but a man is never free of his own habits. Cards awaited him up the road in Leadville, along with the sort of pride that accepts a challenge when a wiser man would wave a hand and go home. The desert had taught him too well. Breath is a coin you spend even when you mean to save it. Back in Arizona, the cowboys boasted that the Earps had run. In towns where men count days by pay packets, the story always belongs to whoever is left to tell it out loud. But the ledger kept by cemeteries offered a disagreeable footnote. The men who had planned ambushes were beginning to find themselves written in past tense. Tombstone's boardwalks dried, its newspapers went to press with more commerce and fewer funerals, and the town discovered that even legends are seasonal. Out on the edges of it all, a gambler with a dental kit he rarely opened, prepared to ride again. North this time, not for vengeance, but for the quieter business of surviving one more winter. The frontier was not finished with him, but it had told him, unmistakably, the price it demanded for the privilege of staying in its weather. He packed light, a coat, a kit, a cough, and a name that could buy both respect and trouble in any room with a table. Arizona faded behind him like the last verse of a song. Ahead waited thin air and the kind of luck that tests a man's hands more than his gun. The deadly dentist of the frontier was still alive. For the moment, that was story enough. Leadville sits high enough to make a man feel every stare like a sermon. Thin air pares away pretense. It also punishes lungs already ruined. Yet the mining camp, bristling with chimneys and raw ambition, promised what Doc always chased: a place where a gambler could earn his keep and a sick man could pretend he wasn't counting hours. The streets rang with ore wagons and immigrant tongues. Saloons were bright as furnaces, their doors turning on the hinge of payday. Doc drifted into Hyman's, a room of brass rails and mirrored bottles, set his back to a wall, and let the talk wrap around him like a coat. He had outridden Arizona indictments and the memory of a billiard room gone silent. He had even managed a laugh or two. High country bravado is a fragile thing, but for a while it held. That summer, a quarrel ripened with a local named Billy Allen. Part debt, part insult, part the kind of wagering feud that multiplies witnesses and improves itself in the retelling. Allen's gait, the tilt of his hat, the way he let a door slam, each became fresh proof a reckoning was coming. Doc knew the arithmetic too well. When a threat repeats itself in a hard town, you either leave before supper or you decide where you'll be standing when the day grows short. August 19th, 1884, the decision arrived. Allen stepped into Hyman's with grievance in his eyes. Doc, thin as a gun barrel and twice as straight, waited near the cigar case, his right hand quiet at his side. The room felt the temperature change. Then everything happened the way it always does in the West when men insist on finishing sentences with iron, quick, at breath's distance, with no time for eloquence. The first shot tore the air. Another followed before the wall had finished echoing. Allen staggered, wounded but alive, as men lunged to shove Holliday's hand down and pin the pistol. The bartender swore. A city officer rushed in. Doc surprised everyone by asking for protection, the words spoken like a man aware that mobs have short patience and long memories. In the charged hush, you could hear Leadville itself, pickaxes in some far shaft, the faint rattle of a streetcar, carry on as if nothing sacred had been disturbed. Arrest came formal as a ledger line, assault with intent to kill. Papers inked their verdicts before any jury did. But when the courtroom finally took its turn the following spring, the story hardened around an old frontier doctrine: self-defense. Witness by witness, hour by hour, 12 strangers weighed swagger against fear and decided Holliday had been a man cornered, not a murderer in search of a stage. The acquittal did not make him stronger. It only let him walk out beneath a sky that felt even higher than before. Winters bit deeper now. Doc's cough shook coins in his pockets and sent a tremor through the glass he lifted after midnight. Pride kept him upright at the faro layout. Pride also kept him from admitting how much effort it took to climb a single flight of stairs. He had chased dry climates across a continent, but sickness is a faithful companion and thin air a blunt teacher. He learned the names of apothecaries in the hours when pain loosens its grip by a fraction. He learned, too, the new economy of courage. Sometimes bravery is not the decision to stand in a lot with a shotgun. Sometimes it is the decision to fold early, find a chair near a window, and keep breathing. The railroad timetable turned, as it always does, and pointed him toward the springs where water breaks from the earth, smelling of matches and medicine. Glenwood Springs, Colorado promised a kind of mercy. Heat in the bones, steam in the lungs, mountain air that doctors praised with the steady confidence of men who have not yet named the bacteria killing their patients. The Hotel Glenwood took him in, all clean sheets and polished banisters. From the porch you could watch the valley tilt away and imagine that health sat just beyond the rise, waiting to be greeted like a neighbor. He soaked in the sulfur pools, skin prickling, chest easing for a moment, then seizing again, relief measured in teaspoons. He ate lightly, slept in patches, and moved about in the rhythm of those who know every stair-step costs. There is a loneliness particular to hotels, even kind ones, and Doc carried it room to room in quiet dignity. The West had given him companions, Wyatt, who would not have lived to wear legend without him. a handful of riders who had measured him by night fires and decided he was worth the saddle sore. And for a stretch of years, Kate, whose sharp wit could pare a man down to his truer shape. Whether she stood near his bed in Glenwood belongs to the fog where history and longing hold hands. Some say she later claimed it, laying flowers on memory's table. Others answer that no reliable witness saw her there. Either way, the room kept its own counsel, and Doc, who had lived through noise enough for 3 men, did not mind the hush. The end, when it came, wore morning light. November 8th, 1887. The calendar squares emptied of plans except the oldest one. He was 36, gray before his time, a gentleman's posture draped over a frame pared down to angles. Local tradition says he looked at his bare feet, a gunman's last inventory, then smiled a little and said, "This is funny." Perhaps he did. Perhaps the frontier loaned him that line in return for the theater he had given it. The truth, certain and simple, is that he exhaled and did not draw breath again. For a moment, the room's quiet seemed like respect. Then the business of the living resumed. They buried him above town that afternoon, as the sun cooled on the ridges. The climb to Linwood Pioneer Cemetery is sharp even for healthy lungs. But the mourners made it, citizens, fellow gamblers, a minister with a book and a voice steady enough to steady others. Mountain soil in November can be hard as iron. The valley gossip later argued about how deep, how soon, how many hands. The marker you find there now sits among pines and mementos, cards left face down, coins winking in the needles, the occasional empty bottle dotted with raindrops, a pilgrim's language, apt for a man whose life was written in wagers. No one knows the exact spot. The early records waver, the ground shifted. A century and its storms had time enough to misplace a legend by a few paces. That uncertainty feels right somehow. Doc always stood a little to the side of the stories told about him. Rumor, as ever, walked a few steps behind the coffin and kept talking for years. That some later had him exhumed and carried home to Georgia. That the stone in Glenwood is only a cenotaph talking to the wind. The documents we can hold in our hands say he lies on that hillside where the town hums below, like a memory. But the Old West files its dead with a certain poetry that scholars cannot fully correct. You climb the hill, you read the name, and you decide how much certainty your heart demands. What, finally, did the deadly dentist surrender? He let go of the hope that skill alone can rescue a body from its sentence. He let go of whatever version of peace he thought a card table might buy. He let go, too, of numbers, of the false accounting that demanded a killer's tally to match a legend's appetite. In the end, there is a quieter ledger, a single man documented beyond dispute, Tom McClory, who fell to the mouth of Doc's shotgun on Fremont Street, a wounded lawman's loyal friend, a patient who made theater of survival until survival ran out. If the West wanted a higher body count, it could look elsewhere. Doc chose precision over plenty. The cough chose the rest. In towns like Glenwood, evening comes early in winter. You can stand by his marker and listen to the wind thread through branches and imagine the whole frontier talking in that voice, rasped but relentless. You can look down at the valley and see rail lines learning their curves, bathhouses breathing steam, and a hotel window where a man once smiled at his bare feet. 1,000 miles away, in barrooms still lacquered with romance, actors will speak his lines and win applause. Tourists will pose in dusters and squint into cameras as if the sun itself were a gun barrel. Up here, the air takes those gestures and cleans them. It leaves you with pine, stone, and a name. John Henry Holliday. Dentist by training, gambler by trade, loyalist by choice. A life that burned hard and brief, like match flame in a desert wind, throwing just enough light to show a friend the way forward. Down in the town, a harmonica might be playing. Up on the hill, there is only the soft scrape of a card set gently against a stone, face down, as if to say, the hand is over and the house has called time. A name as short as Doc was built to travel. It folds easily into a bartender's tale and rides well on a stagecoach of gossip, the way a coin slips through a dozen hands and picks up the scent of each palm. By the time the century turned, Doc Holliday had already been refitted for public use, leaner, meaner, deadlier, because the American frontier prefers its stories carved in bolder relief than the courthouse can supply. The ledger we can read says a dentist turned gambler, sick and stubborn, fired a shotgun on Fremont Street, and helped end a quarrel that had outgrown the size of a town. The legend we inherited says he piled the dead like cordwood, laughed in the face of danger, and aimed with a surgeon's calm. Both versions cast a shadow you can still step into on a hot afternoon in Tombstone. The trick is knowing where the shadow stops and the person begins. The West manufactures myth the way a stamp mill pounds ore, relentless, noisy, and with a talent for separating glitter from stone. Dime novels came first, cheap pages that needed a killer every 3 chapters and a speech every other. Newspaper editors followed, tuned to the frequency of outrage and romance. Even when they aimed for accuracy, their readers brought their own appetites. Then the new century built a silver temple in California, and the movies set Doc in motion. Mustaches waxed, phrases sharpened, a cough turned theatrical. An audience prefers certainty, so the film's obliged. Courage knows its mark, friendship writes checks with gunfire, and a thin man from Georgia becomes the kind of creature that can never quite die. Yet in the quiet lines of depositions and city ordinances, you find a smaller, truer figure, a patient trying to outwalk his illness and keep faith with a friend in a city that begged men to choose sides. The pressure to increase a body count is not merely bloodlust, it is arithmetic. If a man is to be remembered as the deadly dentist, the tale insists on a tally, but the record resists inflation. Tom McClory remains the single death you can plant firmly at Doc's feet with the paperwork to hold it down. That modest number bothers the romantic imagination, which wants thunder where the clerk has written 1. Yet there is a different kind of ferocity and precision, a discipline learned at a dental bench and carried to a card table and a gunfight alike. Do what must be done and no more. On the frontier, scribes rewarded restraint less often than spectacle. Doc's life inverted the terms. Spectacle frequently arrived from the throat that rattled him. Restraint issued from the hands that never quite trembled. His Southern code mattered. Politeness for him was not weakness, it was a small fortification. Sir could be knife or olive branch, depending on how he set it down. He dressed with care because gamblers are theater, and theater is survival. A man who looks composed can talk a room back from the brink. A man who handles cards like instruments can convince a bully that the smartest choice is tomorrow. Doc knew the grammar of that stage, how the arch of an eyebrow could cancel the need for a pistol, how a controlled voice could halt a charge more cleanly than a drawn blade. And when theater failed, he did not. The cough trained him to count seconds and save breath. It also trained him to refuse panic. Illness, that merciless tutor, taught him every hallway in the night. In daylight, he used the map. Tombstone, too, was a teacher. The town's truth is not morality play simple. It was never a contest between white-hatted law and black-hatted bandits. It was a market, and markets require order. Ordinance number 9 did not spring from a philosophical treatise. It came from shopkeepers and insurers who knew that money won't sleep in a city where guns never do. The Earps embraced that economics. Their creed fit a ledger as snugly as a tin star fits a vest. Enforce the rules hard enough to keep capital from spooking. The cowboys had an economics of their own. Open ranges, quick cash, the latitude of vast border grants to men willing to ride at night. Between those models lay the argument that cracked on Fremont Street. Doc stood where friendship placed him, where his own calculation of necessary outweighed any appetite for glory. The law spoke in Spicer's measured prose afterward, but the real sentence was written in the alleys and delivered by shotguns. Walk the streets today and the past will meet you halfway. A reenactment draws a crowd, hats tilt, holsters gleam too clean. The famous 30 seconds are bought and spent on schedule. At Boot Hill, tourists tilt their heads at epitaphs polished by decades of retelling. Commerce has learned to speak both languages, ledger and legend, and the town lives, as it must, by selling memory retail. You may flinch at the theater and long for quiet, but remember, Doc's own life was a performance pitched against oblivion. If the town keeps a stage lit for him, it is a continuity he might have recognized. Down the road, other shrines take their turn. In Glenwood Springs, playing cards and coins gather at a stone above the valley as pilgrims of the prairie pay their respects in the currency he would have understood. Cinema turned him international. Kilmer's drawl and gallows humor, the languid genius of a dying man who outcharmed death scene by scene. That on-screen Doc is not the whole truth, but he is not a lie either. He is a reminder that charisma, in the right hands, can be a moral instrument. Doc's charisma served loyalty first. He never let the desert forget the debt he believed he owed to a friend. When stories attempt to rinse him into hero or villain, the residue that won't wash away is simple fidelity. Wyatt Earp's legend has many contributors. None stamped it more decisively than the sick Georgian who refused to let a saloon quarrel write the ending. There is another legacy hidden in plainer sight. Doc Holliday lived openly with a chronic illness at a time when the body's betrayals were rarely discussed and even more rarely accommodated. The West did not soften itself for him. He adapted. That stubbornness has been misread as bloodthirst. It looks, under a better light, like a refusal to be excused from loyalty or work. In that, he offers a different model of frontier toughness. Not the absence of weakness, but the willingness to ride with it and do the hard thing anyway. He is not an emblem of invincibility. He is a patron saint of persistence. What made him dangerous was not a craving for violence, but a hunger for control in a world that kept subtracting it from his lungs. Cards answer to probability. Dentistry answers to steady hands. Gunfights answer to seconds. He chose arenas where skill could bully chance, and chance properly bullied sometimes gives a man back a day. When talk of his deadliness clouds the view, clear it with that lens. He was in the end an expert in small margins, able to work inside them and live a little longer because of it. So the ledger and the legend keep arguing, and perhaps they should. The frontier deserves both. The documentary truth that can be footnoted and the narrative heat that explains why any of it mattered enough to remember. If you need a verdict, try this. Doc Holliday was necessary. Necessary to the friendship that kept a lawman alive in Dodge. Necessary to the frightening calm that steadied the line on Fremont. Necessary to the logic that told Wyatt Earp, after an alley's ambush and a billiard room's murder, that justice sometimes trails the badge at a distance the badge cannot close. And necessary, too, to our understanding of the West as a place where ordinary mortality met extraordinary resolve. Stand once more in the lot beside flies, close your eyes and listen. The modern traffic will fade, the old argument will resume. You will hear boots on packed earth, the hard whisper of an ordinance meeting a refusal, a cough that counts to 3, a shotgun that writes the rest. Then open your eyes and look down at your hands. The West survives there, in the choices you make when certainty is scarce and time is short. If legend asks you for a chorus and ledger asks you for a signature, remember the man who carried both and paid in breath. Was he hero, villain, or simply the man the hour required? The prairie dust does not answer. It only rises, holds the light for a moment, and settles where the story tells it to.